The truth they heard about your silence left them completely speechless. For so long, they believed your silence meant you had stopped caring. They believed you walked away without fighting for what the two of you had. But today, someone finally told them what was really happening behind your silence. And suddenly, the entire story looked different. Listen carefully. Because what your soulmate just learned about you may have changed the way they see your past forever. There was a time when your soulmate kept asking themselves the same painful question: if I really mattered, why didn't they say something? They replayed the ending of your love story more times than anyone knew. They remembered the distance growing between you. They remembered the conversations becoming shorter, the emotions becoming heavier, and eventually, the silence becoming almost unbearable. From their side, it looked as though you had simply accepted the ending. They thought you had been given a chance to speak and chose not to take it. And that belief stayed inside their heart for much longer than they ever admitted. But there was something your soulmate never understood. Your silence was not empty. It was carrying words you were afraid would make everything worse. It was carrying disappointment, confusion, and feelings you could not explain without reopening wounds that were already deep. You were not standing there without emotion. You were trying to understand how something that once felt so certain had suddenly become so fragile. And while your soulmate interpreted your silence as distance, you were quietly trying not to cause even more damage. Then someone finally stepped into the story. This person had known pieces of the truth for a long time. They had watched your soulmate carry an incomplete version of what happened. They had heard your soulmate speak about you with frustration, sadness, and unanswered questions. At first, they stayed out of it because they believed the past should remain in the past. But recently, something changed. Your name came up again, and this time your soulmate said something that made this person realize they could no longer remain silent. Your soulmate quietly said, "Maybe I never mattered to them the way they mattered to me." Those words changed everything. The person sitting across from them immediately responded, "You still don't understand why they stayed silent, do you?" Your soulmate froze. For a few seconds, they didn't answer. They simply stared at this person because suddenly they could feel that something important was about to be revealed. Something they should have known a long time ago. Then came the sentence your soulmate was never prepared to hear. They weren't silent because they didn't love you. They were silent because they believed speaking would destroy what little was still left between you. Your soulmate's expression changed immediately. All those memories they had interpreted one way suddenly began rearranging themselves. Your quietness. Your hesitation. The moments when it looked like you wanted to say something but stopped yourself. The way you pulled back instead of turning everything into another argument. Your soulmate had spent so long seeing those moments as proof that you were emotionally leaving them. Now they were being told the exact opposite. Don't skip this, because the next thing this person revealed went even deeper. They told your soulmate that there were moments when you desperately wanted to explain yourself. Moments when you almost reached out. Moments when you wondered whether one honest conversation could save everything. But by then, too many misunderstandings had entered the space between you. Too many assumptions had been made. Too many emotions had become tangled together. You were afraid that anything you said would be twisted into something you never meant. And perhaps the hardest truth was this: you believed your soulmate had already made up their mind about you. So you stayed quiet. Not because there was nothing inside your heart, but because there was too much. Your soulmate lowered their eyes when they heard this. Suddenly, they remembered one particular moment from the past. A moment they had almost forgotten. They remembered looking at you and seeing something in your expression that they couldn't understand at the time. You looked like you wanted to speak. You looked like you were holding something back. But instead of asking what was happening inside you, they assumed they already knew. They assumed you were done. And now that memory was hurting differently. What were they trying to tell me? Your soulmate finally asked. The person hesitated. That hesitation made your soulmate nervous. Because this was no longer just a conversation about why you stayed silent. There was apparently something specific you had never been able to say. Something connected to the exact period when your love story began falling apart. Your soulmate asked again, this time more emotionally, what did they want me to know? The person looked directly at them and said, before I tell you that, you need to understand something. You weren't the only one who walked away believing the wrong story. Your soulmate went completely quiet. Because suddenly they realized something painful. Maybe both of you had been grieving the same relationship while believing the other person no longer cared. Maybe both of you had been waiting for words that neither of you knew how to say. And maybe the ending they had accepted for so long was built around a misunderstanding neither of you ever properly confronted. But your soulmate still had one question. What exactly did they keep silent about? The person took a slow breath and finally began explaining what had happened behind the scenes during those final days. And when your soulmate heard the first detail, they immediately realized there was an entire side of your story they had never known. Your soulmate didn't interrupt. They couldn't. Something about the way this person spoke made them realize that the next few minutes might force them to question everything they had believed about the ending between you. The person leaned forward and said, "There's something you need to understand about those final days. While you thought they were becoming distant, they were actually fighting a battle inside themselves every single day. They wanted to reach you, but every time they considered it, they remembered how complicated everything had become. They were terrified that one wrong sentence would close the door forever." Your soulmate stared down at their hands. Suddenly, memories they had buried began returning with painful clarity. They remembered the way you sometimes paused before leaving. They remembered the messages that seemed unfinished. They remembered conversations where your voice changed as though you were about to reveal something important, only to pull back at the last moment. Back then, your soulmate interpreted those moments as uncertainty about the relationship. Now they were beginning to wonder whether those were actually moments when you were desperately trying to save it. The person continued, "There was one night when they almost told you everything." Your soulmate immediately looked up. What night? They asked. The person described it carefully, and your soulmate recognized it almost instantly. It was one of the last nights before everything truly collapsed. Your soulmate remembered feeling angry and exhausted that evening. They remembered expecting you to defend yourself, explain yourself, fight for the relationship, anything. But you had barely spoken. What your soulmate never knew was that before seeing them that night, you had already decided you were going to finally say everything you had been carrying. You wanted to explain why you had seemed different. You wanted to explain what had been hurting you. You wanted to tell them that despite everything happening around the two of you, losing them was never what you wanted. But when you saw the disappointment already written across their face, something inside you stopped. You became convinced they had already decided what kind of person you were. And instead of risking one final rejection, you swallowed the words. Your soulmate's face changed as they listened. So they were going to say something that night? They whispered. The person nodded. More than something. They were going to tell you that they still wanted to fight for the relationship. Those words landed harder than anything your soulmate had heard so far. For years, they had remembered that night as the moment you gave up. They had told themselves that if you truly loved them, you would have fought harder. But now they were discovering that you had arrived prepared to fight. You simply lost the courage when you believed their heart had already closed. Your soulmate leaned back and covered their mouth for a moment. There are truths that bring relief, and there are truths that make old pain feel new again. This was both. Then your soulmate asked the question that had been building inside them since the conversation began. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? The room became quiet. The person didn't answer immediately, and that silence made your soulmate uneasy. Finally, they said, because at the time, everyone thought staying out of it was the right thing to do. People saw both of you hurting. People heard different pieces of the story. Nobody wanted to make things worse. But looking back now, maybe staying silent was exactly what made everything worse. Your soulmate shook their head slowly. It was difficult to accept that something so important could have remained buried simply because everyone assumed someone else would eventually speak. Two people had walked away carrying completely different interpretations of the same ending, and nobody had corrected either of them. But then the person revealed something your soulmate wasn't expecting. There's another reason they stopped themselves from reaching out afterward. Your soulmate's eyes immediately lifted. What reason? The person hesitated again. Your soulmate could feel their heartbeat getting heavier because every hesitation seemed to hide another piece of the story. They heard something about you, the person finally said. Something that convinced them contacting you would only interfere with your life. Your soulmate looked confused. What did they hear? The person explained that after the separation, information reached you suggesting your soulmate was moving forward, rebuilding their life, and possibly trying to leave the relationship completely behind. Whether that information was fully accurate or not, you believed it. And because you still cared, you made a painful decision. you would not return simply to reopen something your soulmate was trying to heal from. That revelation hit differently. Your soulmate had spent all this time wondering why you never came back. Meanwhile, you had believed staying away was an act of respect. You thought contacting them would be selfish. You thought showing up again might disturb whatever peace they had finally found. So while your soulmate waited for proof that you still cared, you stayed away because you cared enough to believe they deserved peace. Neither of you knew what the other person was actually waiting for. Your soulmate whispered, "I wasn't at peace." The person said nothing. "I wasn't moving on the way they thought I was," your soulmate continued. Their voice became quieter. "I kept wondering why they never came back." For the first time during the conversation, regret completely replaced confusion. Your soulmate began seeing the tragedy of what had happened, not as one person abandoning another, but as two people responding to information they believed was true. One waited for a message. The other believed sending that message would cause pain. One interpreted silence as rejection. The other intended silence as respect. Don't skip what happened next, because this was the moment your soulmate stopped asking questions about the past and started asking questions about you now. Do they still think I wanted them gone? The person looked at your soulmate for several seconds before answering. I think they still believe you were better off without them. Your soulmate's eyes filled with emotion. That sentence seemed almost unbearable because it meant the misunderstanding had never truly ended. Even after all this time, you might still be carrying an image of your soulmate that wasn't real. You might still believe they found happiness because you disappeared. You might still believe your silence protected them. And your soulmate suddenly understood that while they had been privately blaming your silence, you may have been privately believing that silence was the kindest thing you could offer. Then something changed in your soulmate. Until that moment, they had been listening like someone trying to understand history. Now they began listening like someone deciding what to do next. They asked, "Did they ever ask about me?" The person smiled sadly. "More than once." Your soulmate froze again. They wanted details immediately. When? What did you ask? What did you say? Did you seem angry? Did you seem happy? Did you ever mention what happened? The questions came faster now because suddenly your soulmate needed to know whether they had truly disappeared from your heart or whether the connection had survived quietly beneath everything else. The person answered carefully. You had never demanded information. You had never tried to interfere. But sometimes, when your soulmate's name appeared naturally in conversation, your entire energy changed. You would ask simple questions. Are they okay? Are they happy? Did everything work out for them? And whenever the answer suggested your soulmate was doing fine, you would become quiet again. You never asked whether they missed you. You never asked whether they regretted what happened. You only wanted to know whether they were okay. That broke something inside your soulmate. Because they realized your silence had never been indifference. Even from a distance, you had still cared about their well-being. Your soulmate stood up and walked toward the window, trying to process everything. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then your soulmate said something so quietly that the person almost didn't hear it. "I wish they had asked me directly." The person replied, "Maybe they wished the same thing about you." Those words stopped your soulmate completely. There it was, the painful symmetry of your story. Both of you wanted clarity. Both of you were afraid of what clarity might reveal. Both of you waited for the other person to create a safe opening, and because neither opening came, silence became the final answer. But the conversation wasn't finished. The person reached into their pocket, pulled out their phone, and said, "There's one more thing you need to know." Your soulmate turned around. "What?" The person unlocked the phone but didn't immediately show the screen. Instead, they said, "A while after everything fell apart, they sent me something. They told me never to send it to you unless I believed you were ready to understand why they disappeared." Your soulmate's face went pale. "What did they send you?" The person looked down at the screen. It wasn't just a message. Your soulmate stepped closer. The person opened an old conversation and scrolled until they reached something that had been sitting there untouched for a very long time. Then they turned the phone toward your soulmate. And the moment your soulmate saw what you had written at the top of that message, their eyes immediately filled with tears. Because the very first sentence revealed that on the night your love story fell apart. Your soulmate stared at the screen without touching the phone. For several seconds, they seemed almost afraid to read beyond that first sentence. The words in front of them had already destroyed one of the strongest beliefs they had carried about your past, that you had simply accepted the ending. But there it was, written in your own words from a time when everything between you was falling apart. You had not wanted to leave. You had been trying to find one final way to reach them. Your soulmate slowly took the phone and began reading. The message was not angry. It did not blame them. It did not try to make them feel guilty. Instead, it explained that you had been struggling to find the right words because you were afraid every conversation between the two of you had become too emotionally charged to survive another misunderstanding. You wrote that you still cared deeply, but you no longer knew whether your presence brought comfort or pain. You admitted that your silence might look cold from the outside, yet inside you were carrying more emotion than you knew how to express. Your soulmate's eyes stopped on one particular part. You had written that if they gave you one calm conversation, without assumptions, without anyone else's opinions, without bringing every past argument into the room, you would finally tell them everything. You wanted one conversation where neither of you had to defend yourselves. One conversation where you could simply tell the truth about what you were feeling. Your soulmate read those words twice. Then a third time. Their hands began trembling slightly because they remembered exactly what they had wanted back then too. One honest conversation. But they had been waiting for you to initiate it, while you had been waiting for some sign that they would actually listen. Why didn't I ever see this? Your soulmate asked. The person beside them answered quietly, because it was never sent to you. Your soulmate looked up immediately. The message they were reading had been sent to this person instead, almost like a confession you needed to release somewhere when you could no longer carry it alone. You had explained that you wanted to send something similar directly to your soulmate but kept stopping yourself. Every time you reached for your phone, you imagined being ignored. You imagined reopening wounds. You imagined discovering that your soulmate had already moved forward. Eventually, fear won. The message remained with someone else, and your soulmate remained unaware that it ever existed. Then they reached another line. Your soulmate stopped breathing normally for a moment. You had written, "If staying away is what gives them peace, then I will carry the pain quietly." Your soulmate lowered the phone. That sentence was almost impossible for them to process because they had never experienced your absence as peace. Your absence had created questions. Your silence had created doubt. And now they were discovering that the very thing that hurt them had been something you believed you were doing for their sake. "I never asked them to carry it quietly," your soulmate whispered. The person replied, "They thought your silence was asking them to." That answer stayed in the room. Suddenly, your soulmate understood how dangerous assumptions had been to your story. You interpreted their distance one way. They interpreted yours another way. Neither interpretation was completely true, but both of you reacted as though it were. Every reaction then created another misunderstanding until eventually neither person knew how to cross the distance. Your soulmate continued reading. You wrote about moments nobody knew you remembered. A conversation that had ended too quickly. A goodbye that felt wrong. A time your soulmate turned away while you were still hoping they would turn back. Small details your soulmate had assumed meant nothing to you were still alive in your memory when you wrote that message. You remembered their expressions, their words, even the pauses between sentences. And with every line your soulmate read, the idea that you had simply stopped caring became harder to believe. Then your soulmate found something even more painful. You had written about one specific moment when you almost called. It was late. Your number was ready. Your finger hovered over the screen. You wanted to ask one simple question: is there still anything here worth saving? But before you called, you received information suggesting your soulmate was finally beginning to heal. You believed contacting them at that moment would drag them backward. So you closed the phone and promised yourself you would not interfere. Your soulmate's eyes filled again. That night, they said. The person looked at them. What? Your soulmate remembered the same night. They had been awake too. And they had been looking at their phone. Waiting. Not necessarily for a perfect apology. Not for some dramatic declaration. Just something from you that proved the story wasn't truly over. Neither of you knew the other person was awake, neither of you knew the other person was thinking about reaching out. And neither of you made the call. Your soulmate sat down again, overwhelmed by how close the two of you had apparently come to changing everything. Don't skip this, because what your soulmate asked next changed the direction of the entire conversation. Why are you showing me this now? The person became serious. Because I realized something recently. Keeping this hidden is no longer protecting either of you. Your soulmate stared at them. The person explained that for a long time, they believed revealing the message would only reopen the past. But recently they had seen your soulmate speak about you again, and they recognized something they could no longer ignore. The pain wasn't coming from knowing the truth. The pain was coming from never having known it. Your soulmate looked back at the phone. Then they asked, did they ever say they hated me? No. Did they ever say they regretted loving me? No. Did they ever say they never wanted to hear from me again? The person shook their head. Your soulmate became completely still. For years, they had been treating assumptions like final answers. And now those answers were disappearing one by one. The person took the phone back and said, "There's another message." Your soulmate looked startled. Another message? This one had been written later, after more time had passed, after the emotions were less immediate, after you had apparently accepted that the two of you might never speak again. The person opened it. Before handing over the phone, they warned your soulmate, "This is the one that made me realize your silence never meant what they thought it meant." Your soulmate took the phone. The message was shorter. But somehow, it hurt even more. You had written that you did not know where life would take either of you. You did not know whether your soulmate would ever understand your side. You did not know whether you would ever be given another chance to explain. But if one day the truth reached them, you wanted them to know one thing. You never stayed silent because the love meant nothing. You stayed silent because you believed you had already lost the right to speak. Your soulmate closed their eyes. That sentence changed something deep inside them. All this time, they had thought your silence was power. They thought you had walked away easily while they were left carrying the emotional consequences. Now they were realizing your silence may have come from the opposite place, from feeling powerless, from believing your words were no longer welcome. Your soulmate whispered, "They thought they had no right to talk to me?" Yes. But I was waiting for them. I know. Those 3 words broke through whatever emotional wall your soulmate had left. They began crying quietly, not because the past could suddenly be erased, but because they could finally see how differently everything might have unfolded if either of you had known what the other was truly feeling. After a long silence, your soulmate wiped their eyes and asked one final question. "Do they know you're telling me this?" The person didn't answer immediately. And that hesitation brought a completely different tension into the room. Your soulmate leaned forward. "Do they know?" Finally, the person said, "No. But before you decide what to do with everything you've heard today, there's something else I need to tell you." Your soulmate's heart began racing again. What else could there possibly be? The person looked directly into their eyes. Your silence wasn't the only reason the two of you never found your way back. Your soulmate frowned. The person continued. There was one final misunderstanding after the separation. And neither of you knew it happened. Your soulmate went completely still. Because according to this person, sometime after your love story fell apart, you had actually tried to send one final message. But that message never reached your soulmate the way you believed it did. And when your soulmate learned what happened to it, they finally understood why both of you had spent so long believing the other person had chosen silence. You had actually been preparing to make one final attempt to save it.